So I'm just going to make a start. I'll just say about why I was doing this in the first place. I think most of you know I've got some background in leadership training, mostly with West African civil servants. And we've got a couple who have joined us here over the last 6-ish years. And while I was, when this all kicked off, particularly in the UK, I noticed a couple of things. One, that the government communication changed overnight. The style of communication, what they were talking about, how they were talking, changed overnight. And it became obvious that there's a wonderful book called Nudge. You probably see that backwards. It was written a few years ago by a couple of Americans, economists and psychologists and lawyers. And their basic premise was we all are human beings and we react like human beings, but economics basically models us as logical, rational creatures, but in fact we're not. And we behave, we respond to different situations and different prompts in different ways because of different biases. It became quite popular, and Tony Blair was a bit of a Nudge fan, and became popular across a number of governments across the world. And there was actually a unit set up within the UK government, essentially looking at Nudge and how to, the basic premise is how to make it easy for people to make the right choices. So it's not about telling people what to do, it's about how to make it easy for people to make the right choices. And suddenly, everything the UK government was saying was about, we are going to make it easy for you to do the right thing here in this difficult situation. So that just got me thinking. And then we saw across the world a unity of purpose that I've certainly never seen before. And we've seen people changing their behaviors far faster than all the theory suggested you should be able to change people's behavior. If I'm talking about change management to an organization, I'll say it usually takes a couple of years to get your staff to change their behaviors. And here we have the whole world changing the way it greets people, changing the way it goes for walks, changing the way it shops, pretty well overnight. So it's an absolutely extraordinary, huge, experiment's too light a word, huge example of good and bad leadership across the world and behavioral change across the world. And I just wanted to look at the situation just from that point of view. I don't want to forget the fact that this is a real crisis and a real tragedy. Literally 5 minutes before this started, I heard that somebody that I was quite close to for a few years died just a couple of days ago, and that's the closest this whole thing has come to me. So I don't want to ignore the human tragedy of this, but I think it's also worth taking a little bit of time out and saying just some of the things that are happening. So we've seen the different examples of leadership across the world, good and bad. The wonderful New Zealand Prime Minister seems to be leading the way in a lot of things that she has done. Trump seems to be, I don't want to mention or deride individuals, but Trumpism doesn't seem to be able to cope with the current situation as it is. West Africa, from what I understand, has gone into lockdown, so the difficulties there are not so much with the disease itself. The numbers are still very low, but absolutely devastating impact on the general economy and the economic welfare of those that are living from hand to mouth, and suddenly their livelihood has disappeared through lockdown. want to concentrate a little bit more on the UK response, if I can use the technology. First of all, I mentioned this behavioural insights team, which was set up as a government department some years ago and is now a government-owned company delivering services across the world in terms of behaviour. And if you look on their website, you'll see their perspective on COVID-19. What they're doing is applying behavioural insights to inform policy, improve public services, and deliver positive results for people and communities. And they really came to the fore at the very beginning of this. So when you see this early picture of Johnson and the Chief Medical Officer and Chief Scientific Officer, just days beforehand, through the whole Brexit fiasco, experts were derided. And then suddenly we have very clear pictures of the Prime Minister being flanked by the experts. They were very clearly, very positively, very visually brought into the picture. That has diminished somewhat, and if you look at the more recent briefings, that initial response has been watered down somewhat. A couple of things happened. One, clearly because of the spread of coronavirus within this grouping, they were seeming to say one thing but behaving in a different way. And that's kind of number one lesson for leaders. You can't say one thing and do something else. Also, the experts were having to toe the government line a number of times. So you had the press asking the experts very direct questions, and the experts were having to work around the answers and give very vague answers. So those undermined the initial efforts. But the initial efforts were very clear and got an immediate response from the British people. Because if you think back just a couple of months, when China went into lockdown, we were all thinking, well, that could never happen in this country. How on earth would that ever happen in Britain? And yet we have accepted lockdown quite positively, or certainly in huge numbers, people have accepted the restraints of lockdown. That's all kind of background stuff. You can see different approaches. Let me just very briefly talk about some of these things. Because we're going to talk about communication and how important communication is and different styles of communication. So one article I found just this morning, in contrast, Boris Johnson pre-recorded his March 24th lockdown announcement, offering no chance of questions from the media. So the whole thing was framed as an instruction, whereas before it was just strong advice or advice. And just below Johnson's picture, I don't know if you can see it, you'll be able to see it later, where Ardern blended direction, care, and meaning making. So those are three core elements of true leadership. Am I providing direction? Am I showing that I care? And am I providing meaning? Well, Ardern blended those three things. Johnson largely sought compliance. We must do this because you must do this. A little bit on the side, but an article from The Economist talking about how the rules of the game has changed and how the economic models globally have been upset and are being reframed. The last thing, and this will relate to how people react and act under certain circumstances, is became popular on Facebook for a little while, and it shows how people respond to the crisis in three basic ways. You can be fearful, you can see it as an opportunity to learn, or you can see it as an opportunity to grow. And some of the behaviors around fear are the old toilet paper thing. Why people went out and collected toilet paper, nobody knows. And there's anger and fear pointed at others. So what you will see on social media and such, like people berating their neighbors for two people going for a walk across a field. In the learning zone, so you're out of fear, not being driven just by the fear, you can take a slightly more analytical view of the whole thing, start letting go of things that aren't within the control, understand your emotions, make yourself aware of the situation and the best way to act. And you have either felt that way at times or seen other people that have been acting that way. And then in the growth zone, you'll have seen people finding a purpose, thinking about how they can help others. You've seen communities come together. You've seen skill sharing. You've seen a huge amount of empathy. We've seen people looking at what the future might look like. So these are all just from the press, and they're about how we have changed our behaviors. Again, all background, so I want to go into some of the underlying theory, leadership theory behind all this. I'm not used to people sitting there listening to me. Please feel free to argue if you want, or tell me to shut up and carry on. So this has really been about leadership. It's the word that has come to the fore. People are looking for true leadership from government bodies across the world. Sometimes we're seeing it and sometimes we're not. The question often is, what is leadership and what is management? Are leaders born or are they made? Blah, 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 blah. I take a very simple approach to all this stuff. For me, leadership is about change. If nothing is changing, you don't need to be a great leader. You just stop people from not doing what they're meant to be doing. So leaders essentially drive change. Managers, on the other hand, management is about maintaining consistency. So there's a set of rules, there's a way of doing things. Do it that way, or you will be punished in some way, or at least your behavior will be challenged and you need to come back in line. So leadership and management, both are required in most situations. But for me, it's two separate things. Leading is about driving change, not resisting change. And management is about maintaining consistency, not delivering change. So there are two aspects of most of our lives, but they have very different characteristics. This is the thing that interested me most initially, because I spent a lot of time talking to people about change management. And for those that don't know, this is the change curve. It's drawn in different ways. It comes from work by Dr. Kubler-Ross, who is an Austrian-American psychiatrist working with people who were at the end of life. And she noticed that people respond to that news and respond to the big changes in their lives in this kind of way. And then people in the business area understood that people deal with all change in this way. So there's an increase in performance and then a drop off in performance and then an increase in performance before you get to a new level, which is higher than the one before. I say normally, whenever, sorry, I've got a message from somebody trying to log in. Normally when I show this, I say, usually this takes months for people to go through this. Sometimes it can take years, sometimes people never get through this. Let me just send this link again. But we've seen massive, unbelievably massive global change in behavior in a remarkably short time. And I'm trying to work it out. I'm trying to think, has what I've been saying over these years actually been wrong? But I think what's actually happened, and we'll explain this a bit more detail, is we're still in this initial phase of change adoption. We haven't got to true change over here. What happens in this initial phase is that there's an increase in performance. So if you're a new manager at work, you'll see the new team improve their performance. And shock in that situation means you've got my attention. The old manager, we're used to working with them. We've got a new manager, you've got my attention, so performance goes up a little bit. A new system is brought into the workplace, you've got our attention. And we will make an effort to make this work. So you see a slight increase in performance. The other analogy we use when talking about this change curve is, to really bring it home, is imagine that, and I just have been told this, imagine that you've been told that somebody close to you has died. We all respond in the same way. One, you've got my attention, nothing else matters. I might have felt hungry, I might have felt tired. No, you've got my attention. But our response is immediately denial. All around the world, whenever somebody says, somebody close to you has died, you say, no, that can't be. And then we've got resistance, which is, no, I'm not going to accept this situation. And I remember my dad died when I was 9 years old. And I remember walking through the local town sort of within days of that. And I kept seeing people who I thought, no, that's my dad there. That was not true. I mentally resisted to a certain extent that I imagined that I saw him around every corner. This is the really interesting bit with the change process. And if you're implementing change as a manager, you will often see this depression. So what you've had is, okay, you're coming along with a new idea, you've got my attention, no, that wouldn't work here. Okay, I'm going to carry on in the West African context of saying, yes, boss, anything you say, boss, that sounds like a great idea, boss, but I'm not actually going to implement any change because I don't believe it at this stage. I'm going to actually resist it, passively resist it. And then you get down to depression, and people often say, same old, same old. I keep referring back to the boss scenario. Got a new boss, they're just the same as the old boss. They came in with all these great ideas. I thought maybe they were going to change stuff, but actually, it's not going to happen. And often, new initiatives, new projects end at this point, and you go back up that slope, and you go back to the old ways of doing things. And this is the danger of what we're experiencing at the moment. Many of us are saying despite the tragedy, despite the human tragedy, many of us are seeing very positive changes in the world over the last few weeks, months. And the danger is that we go back up that curve and end up doing exactly what we used to do, exactly the way we used to do it. The thing with change is, it's not a, I was this and I'm now that. Change is a process. It takes time. It's not a linear process. We go backwards and forwards. So you can go into shock, and then you can go into denial, and then you can go through resistance, and then you go to depression, then you can go back to resistance, and you go back to denial, and then you can move forward. Let me just show you the rest. Exploration is, could this new situation be of use to me? Hope is, I see how this new situation or this new way of doing things could be of use to us. It could be a better way of working. And then finally, you get commitment. This is the new way that we work. And this is how change normally works. So that's the old situation, that's the new situation, and this bit is where the improvement comes. As a leader, you will sell your team or your colleagues or your bosses on this new way of doing things. You will tell them things are going to improve, but very often things get worse. If you're trying to implement change, you have to understand that that's what change looks like, that you won't actually see real improvement until you hit commitment. That will be some way down the line, and individuals within the team will move this through this process at different rates. Particularly for the West Africans, this resistance phase is extremely important. Much of my work is done, as I said, with West African civil servants who work in a very bureaucratic, hierarchical environment. And resistance is seen as being insubordination. Do what you're told, don't ask why, do it the way I say. But actually, resistance is a really important process to go through if you want your teams to change the way they behave, or somebody else to change the way they behave. Because resistance isn't, I'm not having this. Resistance is, I have a view of what the future looks like. You're telling me it's something else. I need to marry the two. I need to move my thinking from my old way of thinking to my new way of thinking. And in doing so, I have questions to ask.
Yeah.
So we've got a request for participants to mute their mics. I'm going to actually mute all if I can.
Jeff, can you?
Can't see how to do that.
Can I interject?
Because of the way I've got my screen. Yeah, if you could mute, unless you have something specific to say, and then shout. Again, you're letting me do too much talking.
Me, can you hear me?
I can hear somebody saying, can you hear me? But I can't see you. Oh, that's John, yeah.
No, it's me. It's Simon.
Sorry, Simon, yeah.
With that model, she originally wrote that for grief, didn't she?
Yes. Well, no, it was actually people who were had been diagnosed with a life-ending disease, and it's the process of them being told that and them being responded to that.
Yeah.
That was then applied to grief, and then
Right.
applied more widely. Yes.
I am familiar with this model, and I think there's a, and I implement quite a lot of change at work. It's my job, basically.
Yeah.
So I think there's, I think it's absolutely bang on, this model, but I do think there's a way of going through shock, denial, resistance, and depression.
Yeah.
Into exploration and hope quickly.
Okay.
And I think it's through management of expectations.
Yes.
I mean, most of the change that I implement are around systems and processes. So I go in and I have a look at a process. I say, well, we can improve that, and this is how we do it.
Yeah.
And the main thing I find through the management of expectations is their buy-in. So I think this model is absolutely correct when something is imposed on somebody,
yes.
or imposed on a group of people.
Yes. Yeah.
Whereas if you get their buy-in before you actually do the change, quite often you can eliminate that first section.
But I think you'll probably also see that resistance during that process of getting the buy-in.
Sometimes, but that's the whole. Yeah, sometimes, but quite often. I mean, when I first started in this job, for instance, the first thing that when I went round to all the employees and saying, "Well, what do you think? What do you want to change? Is there
Yeah,
anything you're really unhappy with?" There was a vast number of people who hated the PO system.
yeah,
So that was an easy win. You know, I just
yeah,
put in a good one.
yeah,
And of course, there's always someone who's going to resist,
yeah,
but that's the way it is because it's change. It's the
yeah,
nature of the
yeah,
beast.
yeah,
But
yeah,
there's also a load of other people who seek change, and
yes,
it really is about their attitude. There's some people who want change and they're
yeah,
looking for change, even when there's no reason to change.
yes, yes. Yeah, no, I'm a great change fan. Yes, no, absolutely. What you're saying is true. I'll talk a little bit more about that acceptance part as well in a moment.
Mm.
But for most of us, for most of the time, we need to be aware that people do need to go through this process, albeit quickly, albeit with support. That expectations absolutely do need to be set. That the first expectation usually is things will not improve immediately and stay improved. That we will go through this process. Too often in the IT world, I find people leaving the project at about this point. So you implement the project, you do your fixes, you have your project closed down report, you walk away as the project manager, and then the team is left with the implementation without the support. So often, in my experience, IT projects ended too early. They didn't go until we actually had commitment and we're actually seeing true improvements.
Yeah, yeah, I agree.
I need to rush through this because this is a very high level summary of all of this stuff. If people want to, then I'll run further, more detailed workshops on each area, and change management will certainly be one of those. This next bit is about who we are as humans. It's a summary of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I've boiled it down to just three because it suits my purposes in this discussion. Basically, all humans need to feel, and it's important that it's to feel, it's not to be. One, secure. And security is a really important one that's playing a huge part in this current crisis. But we all need to feel secure. And for those that know Maslow, the bottom two layers are physiological and safety. And I've combined them both into security. So the simple idea is if we feel frightened, we feel that our lives are at risk, then nothing else matters. It doesn't matter whether you had no sleep last night. It doesn't matter if you had a big row with your wife this morning. It doesn't matter if you've got deadlines looming. If you think your life is an immediate threat, nothing else matters. We need to, and this is a hierarchy, so you need to feel secure first of all. Then we all need to, no matter what level we're at, whether we're the lowest of the low or the highest of the high, we all need to feel that we are valued. Talk about this because a leader's role is largely associated with these three elements. And this meeting is going to end very shortly. Give us 10 minutes and then let's rejoin the second meeting. Anybody, any problems connecting, let me know during those 10 minutes. The third level, which is up to self-actualization, is we need to feel of value. Remember, it's to feel, not to be. So we can be valued, but if we don't feel valued, we can't be of value. There are some people who have managed to overcome this. Gandhi is the one that always springs to mind, that it didn't matter whether his physical security was being threatened. It didn't matter if his colleagues or his people did not value him. His sense of value was so great that he was able to overcome that. But for most of us, for us to feel of value, and we need our teams to feel of value, we need to feel secure, and we need to feel valued, and we need to understand what that value is and see some kind of feedback for it.